before, working my way up from Prep 2 to what they used to call the Scholarship 6. After which, at St Dunstan's, I eventually majored in history, and after St Dunstan's, I went to Oxford in 1975 to read history. And I kind of forgot to leave. I landed a fellowship at the Queen's College in 1989 and stayed there until my retirement 2 years ago, in 2021, and teaching history at Queen. We've got some feedback, haven't we? Somebody may not have muted. So I worked from graduation on the history of London, initially on 19th century London, but eventually turning my attention in the late 90s towards the post-war period. And the book I'm talking about today is really the product of that twist. It's the product of a good 20 odd years actually working, reasons I'll explain in a minute. But at the time I moved, there were very few people working on the post-war period. It's now become, of course, very popular. But I had my own sort of personal reason, non-academic reasons for shifting to that period at the time when I did. It goes back to the early 90s when, by chance, I found myself in the recently unified former East Germany, former DDR, and staying 2 nights in Rostock, about the only place I could find that had any accommodation. Rostock at the time had, after 45 years or so of East German economics, had been effectively largely frozen, so that what you had was a city which had transformed itself relatively little from the post-war years. I mean, a rather modernized centre, but otherwise it reminded me overwhelmingly of a London which I could just about remember as a small child, when London was still a post-war bomb-damaged city. Rostock had still bomb sites. It had fire damage on visible fire damage on buildings. It had peeling paint. It even had, this has nothing to do with the war, a smelly river. And all of that reminded me of the London that I had grown up in as a very young child, and which had disappeared really as I grew up. And it was barely discernible even by 1970. And by the time the book ends in 1979, the city had transformed itself enormously. And it's that transformation that I wanted to look at. Now, I've got just under 30 odd pictures which are taken from the book. All but one of the pictures I'm going to show you are taken from the book. And I'll start by showing 3 in quick succession to indicate the way in which the example of Rostock evoked things which had obviously been buried childhood memories. This is a photo taken by Roger Main in 1960 of the Harrow Road area. And when I talk about bomb sites, I mean, this may simply be demolition for reconstruction, but I suspect this is a site which had remained untouched since 1940 in all probability, in the Harrow Road area of Paddington. I spoke about the smelly river. Those of you of my age or older will remember the Thames being pretty unsalubrious in the early 60s before the cleanup, not a river you wanted to fall into. It was an industrial river, and this is an industrial site. If I were doing this in person, and when I have done this in person, I've tried a kind of party trick of asking people, at least when I was in a London setting, if they could identify where this was. I won't, it's going to be too complicated with the technology to try and do that now. But suffice to say, I've never had an accurate answer. People say Wapping, Bermondsey, and so on, which are all sensible guesses. But the clue is actually in the 2 shining tower stroke spires of Wren churches in the background, which are St James Garlick Hythe on the right and St Mary Alderbury on the left. It's actually Queen Hythe. If you were taking the picture from that spot now, you would have your back to, I think, to Shakespeare's Globe. The Millennium Bridge, the wobbly bridge, would be just on the left, I think, out of picture. And Tate Modern, of course, beyond that, behind your back, on the bank on which you're standing. That area has been completely transformed, but this photo from the late 50s is a reminder of how much of a working port city with an industrial river you could see at this point in London. And the third picture, a smog. It's not the smog. It's not the famous December 1952 smog. But it's actually 10 years later, December 1962, the last great smog before the Clean Air Act really kicked in. And those three pictures, I think, encapsulate the London that I was born into in 1955 and in which I spent my earliest childhood. It contrasts, of course. I mean, in other words, it's a bomb-damaged, it's a Victorian but bomb-damaged, war-scarred city that still had industrial pollution, river pollution, and air pollution, and was in some ways a rather disobliging place in which to live. What we think of course, of London in the 60s is very different. This, if you're interested, is a postcard which I picked up on eBay for a £5, sent by a Belgian visitor to London in 1969. It would have been inconceivable even 5 or 6 years earlier, I think, to find commercial postcard companies producing a card of Carnaby Street. That's rather what had been a kind of West Soho backwater, but as I think most of you will be aware, had become a tourist magnet by the late 60s. Here's a view of the King's Road. It looks remarkably modern to me, but it's actually 1967 or 66, I can't remember which now, the King's Road in Chelsea. Which epitomizes both the sort of the fashion revolution, which is central to so-called swinging London, the way in which London had already become, and I think these are tourists, London and the King's Road in particular have become a tourist magnet. It become a kind of dandy catwalk, and so on, and all of which fascinated foreign observers in the mid-60s because it contrasted so strongly with the rather staid and gloomy image of post-war London that most of those overseas, both in the continent of Europe and in the USA, which focused on and really generated the whole swinging London image, had accustomed themselves to. Now, I obviously had to ask myself, as I say, I didn't approach this subject with a view to writing about swinging London, but you can't leave it out. It's there. We were all, those of us of that age and older, were aware of it. Historians now tend to be rather dismissive. I suppose if there is a consensus, I mean, there hasn't been all that much written about it actually, but if there is a consensus about this cultural phenomenon, it is that it was a kind of elite exercise, that it was enjoyed by the same sort of people as you see here. This is David Hearn's fantastic, I think, photo of the Queen Charlotte Ball in 1967, the height of the London season, which, though the season in its traditional Victorian or interwar sense was really on its last legs, exercises like this continued. And the assumption, I think, amongst most historians is that these are really the same sort of people who are living it up in swinging Chelsea or swinging Soho in the period I'm talking about, and that most real Londoners, in inverted commas, had a completely different experience. This completely different experience, I mean, one completely different experience they had is commuting. This is a picture which will be familiar, I think, again to those of my age or older who lived in southeast London. This is a delayed evening rush hour train at Charing Cross, which the delay caused it to be absolutely rammed, as you can see. There's nothing very swinging about this, but this was, of course, the life that most ordinary Londoners had to lead, had to experience. And so is this, the office life. London experiences a massive shift from industry to the service economy, the service sector, from the late 50s onwards, and the service sector expands from the late 50s in a way that completely kind of flummoxes post-war town planners who had wanted to decentralize economic activity from the core of London and saw it expanding in both the city and Westminster at a rapid rate. This, by the way, is Homer Sykes' 1978, I think. It's late 70s, so slightly later in the period I'm talking about. But a photo of the stereotypical office and the stereotypical female secretaries. One chapter I would have liked to have put in this book, had I found ways of researching it, would have been something on the phenomenon of the secretary. I couldn't find a way of doing it, and I couldn't take any longer to finish the thing. But it's a very important aspect of London life that still remains understudied. So there's a kind of regular Londoner that at first glance seems completely sort of detached from the more glitzy, swinging side of the city that people are familiar with, at least in the 60s. That's all true. I accept, in that sense, the dismissal of any assumption that people spent their entire lives living it up in 60s London, let alone in 70s London, which undergoes something a lot grimmer and a lot more demanding in many ways. I accept that, but I think anyone of my generation would find it hard to dismiss altogether the idea that there was a kind of cultural transformation happening in this period. I wasn't really old enough to be part of it, but it was impossible to escape the knowledge. It was impossible to escape the music, of course, in the first place, which is core to the 60s cultural revolution, if you can call it that. Impossible also to be aware of the way in which fashion, mores, and so on was being transformed in that period, even as a 10-year-old at the time when the whole swinging London notion exploded onto the scene. Even as a 10-year-old, I was aware of that. And I think anyone older than me would have found it inescapable. It generates culture wars comparable to those of the present in British society and London society in particular. Merely dismissing it as a kind of phenomenon of the jeunesse dorée, of the sort of Chelsea set, or whatever you want to call them, I think there's something wrong with that. And if you dig deeper, if you look harder, there's some of it sticks and some of it doesn't. After the introductory chapter, which isn't really an introduction as such, it's rather a kind of extended piece of scene setting, I look at a couple of aspects of the 60s London phenomenon, which ultimately proved ephemeral, in order to look at what lasted. So the first of those, I have to admit, a chapter that I had put in really because I could. I researched it because I could. Was on the whole phenomenon of Soho and the sex trade, which really explodes from the late 50s and is then 20 years later pretty rigorously curbed. So it becomes a kind of 60s phenomenon. This photo is of the so-called Naked City Club in Soho. One of a number. The reason I said I did this chapter because I could is that the Greater London Council and its predecessor, the London County Council, accumulated a lot of written material about what was going on in clubs that they were supposed to either license or prosecute. And so the London Metropolitan Archives, where this material lives, provides an extraordinarily vivid set of accounts compiled by the police or by the local authorities themselves of what was going on and who was driving it in this weird and transient world that Soho came to represent. I end that chapter by saying that ultimately this is ephemeral. Ultimately, London decides not to become a kind of Bangkok or Amsterdam. It had seen a particular area develop very rapidly into the city's kind of erogenous zone, then decides that this is all too much to stomach and does away with it, or at least curbs it quite severely. But as a sort of case study in 60s mores, it is, I found absolutely fascinating. I used to get a lot of questions about whether I was doing any original research in the whole striptease world, to which I would answer that I was doing lots of it in the London Metropolitan Archives. The third chapter in the book, the second of these Death of the 60s chapters, looks at the similar sort of rise and rapid fall of the 60s fashion trade. Now, of course, the fashion industry remains absolutely central to London's prosperity today, but the 60s version of it proved more flaky than one might imagine. It was based on the boutique, and this is one. It's a Carnaby Street boutique. I don't know which one. It's not identified in the photo. Clever photo. I thought at first it was a fisheye lens. In fact, it's a convex mirror that a regular photograph of a convex mirror of a customer inspecting a kind of tomato red shirt and all manner of other colour visible in the material on the shelves, on the wall, on the back wall, and so on. The boutique model of which this is so representative proved to be sort of shaky, and part of the chapter looks at the way in which all manner of people with no real experience in the fashion trade thought that they could set up a boutique and flourish, and most of them came to grief when the economy turned down in the 70s. Essentially, you either had to grow big rapidly or you went under. But even if you grew big rapidly, you couldn't guarantee survival. The classic example of this, which is really the theme of that chapter, is the phenomenon that was Bieber, which grew from a regular, more or less regular boutique in Abingdon Road off Kensington High Street, moved to Kensington Church Street and then to the High Street itself, where it occupied all 7 floors of the building, which now the bottom 2 floors are occupied by the pretty capacious Whole Foods store in Kensington High Street today. And it becomes a kind of hippie department store. And this is the food hall of it. In other words, it moved out from mere fashion into selling pretty well everything, cosmetics, food, as well as both men's and women's clothes. And it goes under. It falls victim to those harder times of the not the winter of discontent, sorry, the 3-day week and the OPEC crisis and the inflationary crisis of the mid-70s, which sees it off. And in a rather symbolic way, the Bieber store, as I say, a kind of hippie department store, is taken over, or at least much of the floor space that it occupied is taken over by Marks and Spencer, a sort of suitably sensible, if mundane, replacement. So that chapter looks at the way in which the 60s fashion industry in London, which had done so much to symbolize the swinging London phenomenon, proves in its own way non-durable. What lasts are different forms of consumerism, I moved from looking at Bieber and its woes to um, a chapter on eating out. And I should say, as it's probably becoming obvious already, that this is not a kind of linear history. I'm looking at a relatively compressed period of 20 odd years. And within that period, I'm looking at individual aspects which I thought threw some light on the life of the city. I felt at a very early stage I didn't really want to write a linear history, that it's not really possible to capture the whole sort of complexity and diversity of a place like London by writing a straightforward narrative history. So instead, I aimed at writing individual case studies of aspects of London life. The book consists of 16 of them, of which the first is a kind of extended introduction and the last a kind of extended conclusion. But in between are studies of individual topics. And this photo is taken from the 4th chapter, which looks at the whole business of eating out, because this, above all, proves to be one of the most durable aspects of the swinging London scene. It's very much part of it to begin with. I mean, both Soho and Chelsea are the real centres of the restaurant revolution, if you like, of the early 60s. To begin with, it's centred, as you can see from this picture of the Trattoria d'Artello in, I think, Dean Street, it was in Soho anyway, which was one of the pioneer trattorie of the period. Not the most famous, but actually one of the earliest. This food revolution was centered on a kind of infinitely eclectic sampling of foreign cuisines. Whereas in Paris, in this period, you find, before the advent of Nouvelle Cuisine, you find what is really a kind of endless refinement of the traditional Escoffier tradition. And in London, suddenly recreational eating out is branching into all manner of different foreign types of foreign food. The Italians lead the way, but by the late 60s, early 70s, it's possible to eat almost any type of cuisine you can think of in London. This is not altogether obvious, this is Greek, in fact. This is the Venus Kebab House in Charlotte Street in Fitzrovia. Charlotte Street, which before the war had been a largely Italian stronghold, where it was said that in the 1900s you could hardly hear English spoken. But with the internment of so many Italians during the war, its focus shifts. This here is a Greek restaurant attempting to emulate Mediterranean outdoor eating, which is a leap of faith in the London climate, of course, but it seems to be doing fairly well. In this picture, in the background, you can see Schmidt's restaurant, which actually is a German restaurant, which goes back to before the First World War. And of course, further in the background, you can see what we used to call the Post Office Tower. But the point of this chapter, I think, is to look at the way in which this type of consumerism would last. There's a quote towards the end from the sort of great Evening Standard restaurant critic Fay Maschler in 74, following the woes of that difficult 73-4 winter, pointing out that even at the most difficult points of the 3-day week and so on, in early 74, people didn't actually stop eating out. The habit had become embedded. They might go to cheaper restaurants, they might go less frequently, but they didn't stop. And she was absolutely right about this. And of course, as soon as the economy stabilized, the restaurant sector continued to grow. So where we can legitimately, I think, say that some aspects of the 60s London phenomenon proved ephemeral, didn't last. This is a prosperous city. Prosperous cities generate consumerist habits, and some consumerist habits will prove durable. The most durable consumerism of a lot, of course, in this period relates to the urban fabric, to houses. The next chapter looks at the phenomenon of the evolution of London's housing market in this period in ways which are indeed to prove lasting. I'll show two photos at once now. This is Susanna York, the actor, decorating her newly acquired house in Seaton Street in Chelsea. I'll say more about that in a minute. This is the Samuda estate on the Isle of Dogs, newly built, photographed by John Gay in about 1965 or 6, I think. One, of course, is an example of gentrification, as we now call it, and as a beginning to call it then. The other, an example of modern social housing, which is proliferating already in the Isle of Dogs and the rest of the East End and in inner South London, and indeed in West London, Paddington and beyond. There is, I think, a kind of undeclared warfare, at least tension, between these two ways of solving the housing problem. That there was a housing problem in the 50s, there's no doubt. London's housing stock had taken a hammering, both obviously from the war and also from the perpetuation of wartime rent control into the late 1950s, which had caused much of an aging housing stock to age further and more rapidly. If you'd asked any observer, I think, in the early 60s, which way of reviving the housing stock would ultimately prevail, I think they would have said this one. The assumption, I think, then was that housing would be the next great battleground of the welfare state, the next area in which social provision would be extended, and that a lot of it would take the sort of form we see here. In the event, of course, that proved not to be the case. Now, the underlying significance of this photo of Susanna York, which is not obvious from the photo, but she had just bought this house with her husband on the, she was Chelsea born, in fact, born and bred, but she bought this house with her husband in a street which had become very trendy, Seaton Street, but which was threatened by the planned World's End social housing estate that the London County Council intended to build. And although the houses in Seaton Street were certainly not slums, the old problem that municipal housing always encountered of having to buy up a greater area of land than was actually in slum condition in order to house people at an acceptable density meant that Seaton Street and the houses in it were scheduled for compulsory purchase. And this became in the early 60s a kind of cause célèbre, a major battle fought by York herself and her husband, by Robin Maugham, the nephew of Somerset Maugham, the novelist, and himself a novelist too, who also lived in the same street. They lost this battle, but ultimately the gentrifiers and the owner-occupiers would win the war. I bracket the two together because one of the points I want to make in this chapter is that there is no hard and fast line between the kind of parody gentrification that we're probably familiar with, that actors like Susanna York buying houses like this one in Chelsea and sprucing them up through what the geographers call sweat equity. I mean, that's the kind of standard image of gentrification, but there's no hard and fast line between that and more straightforward, the more straightforward transition of less pretty and less bijou sort of property out in the suburbs, in the sort of area where I grew up in Catford and so on, from private renting to owner occupation. And you see a steady drift into owner occupation over the period that I'm looking at. At the same time, this kind of thing becomes unsustainable. Local authority housing, though much encouraged in the post-war years and indeed in the late 50s, so far as slum clearance was concerned, becomes by the mid-70s or so unsustainable. And in particular, the Department of Environment essentially throws in the towel. It says that London land is too expensive, London building labour is too expensive, and the practice, the post-war practice of throwing piles of money at social housing is no longer, in the straitened circumstances of the 70s, is no longer sustainable. And housing programs are cut back quite sharply in the 70s at the same time as this kind of thing is on the rise. You end up with a situation in which owner occupation in London accounts for just under 60% of the total housing stock by the end of the period I'm looking at. Social housing for around 32% or so. And the private rental sector, which had, of course, been dominant for much of the city's modern history, is being steadily squeezed almost out of existence during the 80s. And it creates a kind of have and have not situation, particularly as the social sector becomes in practice inaccessible to new entrants for reasons which I won't go into now, but I can amplify in the Q&A if people want. More follows in the book on the built environment. This, of course, is an environment that wasn't built, but the chapter that follows looks at the steady development of what I call a conservation consensus. London was a city which had involuntarily lost a good deal of its familiar, perhaps comforting urban fabric in 1939 to 45. From the mid-50s onwards, a lot more is threatened in the name of redevelopment and modernity and modernism. And it generates gradually, by means of specific controversies over the demolition of the Euston Arch and the coal exchange in 1962, both widely regretted, both, I think, unnecessary. It generates a gradual sort of determination to hold on in the face of quite sustained developer pressure to hold on to what could be preserved, and which ultimately leads, I think, to a kind of default position of conservation, which has lasted to the present day, though I think it is being threatened again. En route, we have three major controversies over rather, to my mind, grandiose public sector building or remodelling schemes affecting Covent Garden, Whitehall, and, as here, Piccadilly. You can tell it's Piccadilly because you can see, if you look closely, you can see Eros on its plaza relocated, but otherwise there's no way of knowing. I couldn't even tell you what the orientation is here. Is this looking north? I don't know. It might be, it might not be. I can't tell. This is the scheme produced for the Greater London Council by Sir William Holford, one of the leading town planners of the post-war period, for the renovation of Piccadilly Circus. It's based on what had become a kind of orthodoxy in the early 60s, that is the separation of traffic from pedestrians, hence the plaza, hence the roads running under it. And the principle of segregation adopted as a means of accommodating the car in an urban setting, which is all very well. I'm personally cautious. I'm always cautious about reviling 60s or modernist architecture too sort of comprehensively. I'm old enough to remember when Victorian architecture was still dissed by large numbers of people and thought of as being kind of cheap or tawdry or tasteless. And we've changed our view on that completely. I think we will change our view and are changing our view on 60s modernism. Having said all that, this is a mess. This is incontrovertibly a mess. It's what happens, I think, when you give free rein to town planners with no architectural sense. And there's no, to my mind, there's no cohesion to this. Covent Garden was a mess too, actually, the plans were. And Whitehall had a greater sort of integrity, but was never going to be built. I think never going to be built. And this isn't. And by the time the book finishes, this kind of thing is really, in an area like Piccadilly Circus, as central and as emotionally significant as that had become, is never going to be built. This photo, I'd be interested actually as to whether anyone recognises it. It's I end the conservation chapter by looking at a piece of correspondence between a man called Anthony Dale at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, who was, among other things, duties in charge of listing of buildings, and Nicholas Pevsner, the architectural critic and historian, who was, among other things, the president of the Victorian Society, about the fate of this building in Eastcheap in the city, designed by the Victorian architect R.L. Rumio, not a particularly well-known architect, in 1868 as a vinegar warehouse. As you can see, it's about as quirky a piece of Victorian Gothic as you could have. Pevsner wanted it listed, and Dale's reaction was essentially, "You're having a laugh." That he was still of the generation that thought of listing as the kind of thing you do for St Paul's Cathedral or the Tower of London or whatever, but not for oddball things like this, not arguably for mid or late Victorian buildings at all. But if you have to go to that as late as that, then it should be for engineering masterpieces like the roof of St Pancras Station and so on, not for things like this. But it survives. It survives to the present. This is actually a picture from 2007, the only non-contemporary picture in the book, in fact. And its survival, I think, epitomizes the changing attitude towards the sort of building which, by the sort of high modernist canons, would have been regarded as almost immoral. This sort of thing is regarded as too frivolous to be taken seriously. And you have to say that in no way is this a building best suited for the financial sector of a global city. But I don't know exactly what it has become. It's no longer a vinegar warehouse, but it is still a surviving building in the City of London, which of course has undergone a lot of sort of redesign since. A bit of a gear shift now to the East End. This is an aerial view of the Isle of Dogs, as I'm sure you know. Before Docklands, after the closure of most of the upriver docks in the late 60s, early 70s, but before anyone had decided quite what to do about the area. The chapter looks at the fate of East London Docklands through the story of the comprehensive development area, Stepney and Poplar comprehensive development area, that was declared and legislated for immediately after the war, and which ground forward over 3 decades with really relatively little to show for it before the whole question was subsumed in the wider Docklands regeneration issue. It was intended, like so much post-war planning, to provide a kind of holistic area renewal with not only the provision of modern housing to replace what had been bombed or what would be demolished on slum clearance grounds, but also things like open spaces, churches, and what have you. And as I say, it's called comprehensive development, and that's what it was. In practice, the scheme gets bogged down both through the complexities of land acquisition and so on, but also through friction between the first tier London County Council local authority and the second tier Stepney and Poplar councils, which were less enamoured of the whole comprehensive development ethos and simply wanted as much housing as possible. There are two lessons from this whole saga. One, that the established mode of redevelopment and indeed the way in which the East End as a whole had been treated for half a century, that is by pouring large amounts of money either from richer parts of London or from central government into the area, was becoming increasingly unsustainable. And the second lesson was that the whole local environment was effectively contaminated by the attempt to build a better one. This photo by David Granick in the Tower Hamlets archives, I think, shows this pretty clearly, that in the background you have the three towers of the Stifford estate, a Stepney Council housing scheme, which was built in the early 60s and, in the way of these things, demolished in the mid-90s. And those blocks are no longer, it looks like a brave new world, but those blocks are no longer there. But the lesson really is what's in front. It's a wasteland. And much of the East End became a wasteland for a very long time. The area sees a sort of steady and increasingly rapid depopulation before even the closure of the docks from the late 60s, simply because it is just not a nice place to live. And we hear a lot now about the sort of cozy environment, community spirit and all the rest of it, but actually the East End was pretty grotty in the period I'm talking about. I remember it myself from the 70s. I'm not, of course, an East Ender, but I used to go traipsing around London and took on board a lot of what was happening in Wapping and Whitechapel and wherever. A lot of what was happening was this: the creation of what's essentially a kind of urban desert, which took a very long time to heal. And so people got out. A bit of a gear shift, literally, though actually less than you might think. One of the groups that got out of the East End and moved in large measure to Essex, London, was the taxi driver. I have a whole chapter on the London taxi drivers, which I have to say is, I think, in my entire career, the thing I most enjoyed researching. It's a story of what I call it the London cabbie and the rise of Essex man. The story is one of a transition from a group which starts as East End proletarians employed in large proprietor-owned garages, and ends with these people having become essentially small-scale entrepreneurs, owning their cabs. I mean, pretty well all taxi drivers, London black cab drivers now own their own cabs, their owner drivers. In 1960, only a small minority were. They leave in large numbers, they leave the trade union. They have been fully unionized and leave the trade union to form what is more like a trade association, the Licensed Taxi Drivers Association, LTDA, which still exists. They become suburbanized. They move out to places like Romford and Basildon and so on. And in the process, they switch, many of them, from being East End socialists to being suburban Thatcherites. That corner of Essex shows the biggest swing to the Conservatives in 1979 of any part of London. Elsewhere in London, the swing to the Tories is not that remarkable in London, but in Essex, London it is, and not all taxi drivers, of course, but they embody that development within the London working class, which you can see the roots of it in their economic transformation in that period. More conventional suburbanisation is evident here. This is a street in a house in West End Lane in Pinner in the London Borough of Harrow, which to my mind, I could talk for an hour about this picture alone. I mean, it captures so many aspects of suburbia, the sort of manicured lawn, the topiary, this weird combination of half timbering and pebble dash on the front of the house, and that rather quaint sort of rustic garage in the background. The next chapter looks at the whole phenomenon of outer London, outer suburban politics, the development of a politics which is really centered on the house and on the environment. London's suburbanites in the 70s enjoyed a high standard of living. They displayed a greater satisfaction level both with their accommodation and with their neighbourhood than almost anywhere else in Britain. And this was measured in the 70s in a rather sort of forward-thinking way. And the London suburbs come over as being enormously both satisfied, but also at the same time anxious that they had something to lose. Hence the concern with conservation, with maintaining the integrity of their area, preventing modernizing development, and also increasingly a concern with local taxation and with the burden of the rates as they used to be. What this does is to transform the conservatism of what were always steadily solidly conservative areas. We see, I mean, the way I characterize it is a shift from what I would call a kind of Heathite conservatism focused on development and still practiced by many of the local authorities in the area, towards a more Thatcherite household conservatism, which emphasizes anti-socialism, very strongly anti-socialist at the time when Labour is in control of the Greater London Council in the mid-70s, and is increasingly preoccupied with the burden of local taxation. And that increasingly sharp-elbowed form of conservatism becomes a feature of London life in this period. Another gear shift. There are two chapters looking at race, both actually preoccupied with the Afro-Caribbeans. I mean, I would like to write more. And one of the things some of the reviewers said about the book is where are the South Asians and so on. But I suppose growing up in Lewisham, it's this community, as far as one could be familiar with, let alone understand the community, an ethnic community that's not one's own. It's the Afro-Caribbeans I'm most familiar with. There's one chapter which is not really easily illustrated on, in the 60s, the development of a kind of race etiquette, a reaction to the rioting in Notting Hill in 1958, which led both to attempts at sort of racial, generating racial harmony, and also to the emergence of a kind of sense in public discourse that you should not use racist terms. So you get in the 60s, even people expressing sort of egregious racist sentiments would preface them with phrases like, well, I'm not a racialist, but, or some of my best friends are black people, blah, blah, blah. The next chapter looks at the way in which this broke down in the 70s, in large measure, I think, because of the emergence of what we loosely, probably wrongly called second generation immigrants, i.e. people who were either born in Britain or had moved with their parents at a very young age from the Caribbean to Britain, and saw themselves as British, but also felt very firmly excluded from British society. This is a wonderful picture, actually, from Colin Jones's wonderful photo essay of the so-called Black House in Harambee in Holloway Road, which was a kind of refuge for young black youth who'd otherwise be living on the streets, who found themselves in perpetual conflict with the police. The chapter which is focused on the tragedy, really, of the Notting Hill Carnival riots in 1976 looks at the way in which, I mean, it is really a tragedy, a kind of Shakespearean tragedy, in which the Metropolitan Police first seek to refurbish their own image through by using the Carnival, Notting Hill Carnival, as a kind of well, as a platform for ingratiating themselves with the local black community. This is from the 1977 Carnival. In fact, the day before that one turned nasty. What happened in 76 was that ultimately it is decided that you can no longer turn a blind eye to the sorts of problems that were arising with large numbers of people massing on the streets, of pickpocketing and so on. And from years of attempts to turn the carnival into a kind of exercise in harmony, we suddenly have a complete explosion in which hostility between the blacks and the Metropolitan Police is played out in a vicious way on the streets of West London. I don't, I slightly regret, life's too short, but I slightly regret not being able to say more about ethnic minorities in London. That clearly is an important aspect of the city's development. But I do, though, talk about the development of left politics in the city, which follows a similar sort of trajectory from harmony to discord, where they're over the period that I'm looking at. This rather amusing picture is taken as a photo of a wheelbarrow race at the Poplar Labour Association, local Labour Party's women's branch in circa 1962. An example of old Labour at play, if you like, of the kind of associationalism that had been generated by traditional local Labour parties in the inner city. Also in the East End, and only about a decade later, though, you get this. At Newham North East, the meeting to deselect the man in the middle of the picture with an inappropriate smile on his face, Reg Prentice, who has come under attack from left-wingers in his own constituency party on account of his own, well, I suppose you say centrist, in Labour Party terms, right-wing views. It's a measure of the way in which Labour moves from being a kind of rock-solid inner-city party to something a lot more complex. Not, I think, because of conscious entryism by militant tendency or anyone else, though there was some of that, but rather a reflection of the changing nature of left-wing politics in this period. The absorption by the Labour Party of a number of people, radicals coming out of the 60s, university expansion, also white-collar radicals in the public sector, in social work, in local authority work, teachers and so on, moving into the Labour Party, often after having sampled far-left politics or community politics in the early 70s, but taking it over, taking over, in this case, taking over the local party and a number of other parties where a traditional old working class Labourism was rendered vulnerable by deindustrialisation and the simple dwindling of the old working class. Bringing about tensions which were seen not only here in Newham, but also in Hayes and Harlington, later, of course, in Bermondsey, which one way or another, shake the kind of local political fabric. The final chapter, which I see it's high time I moved on to, is, as I said, a kind of extended conclusion. It looks in more detail at the phenomenon of deindustrialization in London. This photo is of the Surrey commercial docks in 1976, a good 7 years after the docks had closed. I don't know whether that lorry had been there for 7 years on the verge of toppling into the water, but it is a sign of the decay, not just of the docks, but of pretty well all old style inner London industry in the 70s. It generates a lot of declinist talk about how London is going to be the new Jarrow, the new equivalent of the interwar depressed areas, which has a bone of truth in it. But ultimately, as the Department of the Environment was very anxious to point out to all those who came to it with the begging bowl, London was still a prosperous place. If you look at beyond inner London, if you look at London in the context of the Southeast as a whole, it is doing very well. And the sort of consumerism and so on that I described earlier has not died out, and it doesn't die out in the 70s. What we're getting instead is something rather different. An enhanced polarization between the majority who are doing well in what, as I say, is a very prosperous city, and a minority who are increasingly suffering the deprivation that inner city blight, deindustrialization, and so on would bring. This is the one picture I have in this presentation which is not in the book. The reason for including it is that although the book, as I said, consists of 16 freestanding essays, there is an overarching theme to it, and that is that what's happening in London in the 60s and 70s really clearly anticipates what happens in Britain as a whole in the 1980s, in Thatcher's Britain, in other words. There's a lot, I think you have picked up quite a lot from what I've said already. I mean, the fundamental contrast between growing majority prosperity and the impact of deindustrialization, a flourishing service sector and a shrinking industrial sector at the same time. If you look at this in income terms, you see a clear difference between majority prosperity, and it is a substantial majority who are increasingly prosperous, and the situation of those at the bottom of the income scale. I mean, I worked out in a graph in the first chapter that there's something like a 12% drop in real terms, in real income of the lowest quartile in the family income study. From about 1967 to 1979, those at the bottom of the pile, in other words, do badly. But others do well, and not just the very well off, not just the sorts of people we saw at Queen Charlotte's Ball, but the solid majority. You also have less obvious aspects. I've spoken already about the growth of owner occupation, which we identify with the 80s, of gentrification, which we also, I think, identify with the 80s, but it actually is a lot older in London and is rampant in the 60s, 70s. I've talked about conservation, which is actually, the 80s in Britain will be the golden age of conservation. There's always a nostalgic side to Thatcherite conservatism, and it takes this form. I've talked about the difficulties faced by the Labour Party as it changes its inherent nature. I've talked about the problems faced by and the growing resentment voiced by minority ethnic communities, which take the form of rioting in 1976 and will take the form of national rioting in 1981 and 1985. Now, none of this, and there's a lot more I could say actually, the rejection of 60s values of modernity and modernism, even early proposals to abandon, to abolish the Greater London Council, you see in the period I'm talking about, all of which will become more evident in in the 80s. Now, to say all this is not to deny Margaret Thatcher's significance as a political figure. I don't think anyone could do that. It's very difficult to shift the dial politically ever in the way that she undoubtedly did in the 80s. But I think anyone who does attempt to do that needs to have the ground already prepared for them in some way or another. And the purpose of the book is to demonstrate, to argue that that's what was really happening in London in the 60s and 70s by means of a number of, I hope, closely focused case studies that I have described. So it came out last year in hardback. It's coming out in paperback in March next year with Princeton University Press at a very reasonable price. Even the hardback was only 30 quid and cheaper still on Amazon. So should you not have feel frozen out by what's gone on in the last hour, go and buy it either now or when it comes out in paperback in March. Sorry for overrunning as always, but thanks very much for listening.